On Tuesday evening, the first reports came out that the White House was preparing to redefine Jews as a nation. Now, you've heard the joke from me and probably from many others many times that you have two Jews and you end up with three opinions. But in those early moments when the news first broke, perhaps more than any other time, Jews of all political stripes, backgrounds, denominations, ages, were perfectly united in their response. Huh? What? How? Why? We, as a people, were perfectly, beautifully, utterly confused. That confusion did not last long because, and perhaps because we are Jews, we soon turned to panic. I'll get to that part later. But initially, that reaction was confusion. And this is one of those things that the more that you think about it, actually, the more confusing it becomes. Redesignate Jews as a nation? We already are a nation. God's first words to Abraham are that he will become a goy gadol, a great nation. That same term is used again in the following week's Torah portion. The focus of this week's Torah portion, Jacob and Esau, they are referred to as Shnei Goyim, two nations. Sometimes the words change. In Exodus, God calls us a Goy Kodesh, a holy nation. But the point is that the Torah calls the children of Israel a nation countless times. And not once does it call us a religion. The Torah doesn't have a word for religion. Politics aside, this is a time to make something clear. We are not a religion. If you don't believe me, consider the following examples. If we were just merely a religion, how could it be that Tevye, a character who is famous for misquoting and misunderstanding the most basic tenets of Judaism, is somehow a quintessential Jewish character? To use a more timely example, how is it that when Jon Stewart hosted The Daily Show, he would reference his Judaism proudly on an almost nightly basis, yet he was famous for taping his show on Yom Kippur? How is it that you can get your DNA tested and receive a report that tells you how Jewish you are? You can't do that for a religion. If you're wondering, your rabbi, yours truly, is 56% Jewish, by the way. I share that to illustrate how problematic it is to attempt to define Judaism by DNA, but the point still stands that Judaism is so much more than what the dictionary definition says of a religion, of a bunch of shared spiritual beliefs. Allow me to quote from Avraham Infeld: "We, Jews, are not a religion, and we've never been a religion. Judaism is the culture of the Jewish people." So if all that's true, how could we possibly be upset by the government redefining us as what we already are? Many of you know the answer. There is another side to all of this, of course. Those who wish us ill, those who hate us, they also believe that we are more than a shared set of spiritual beliefs. We tend to use the term anti-Semitism as a catch-all for people who have something against Jews. But there's a difference. For most of Jewish history, Jews suffered from anti-Judaism. It was those religious beliefs of Judaism that were the problem. This changed in 1873 when Wilhelm Marr coined the term anti-Semite and proudly declared himself to be one. In his framing, it wasn't Judaism that was the problem. It was Jews. This might seem like a minor distinction, but it had enormous and horrific consequences. Once the issue shifts from being about your faith to being about you, well, there's nothing you can do about it. Wilhelm Marr invented the concept of anti-Semitism. He was also responsible for another word that was coined 71 years later: genocide. The problem is the word nation means two very different things. The Torah was written a few millennia prior to the advent of the modern nation state. and the respective inhabitants that we began to call nationals. It's confusing. And that's before trying to explain how the nation of Israel can mean something entirely different than, well, the nation of Israel. It took me a bunch of graduate school classes to appreciate the difference, and who knows if I've even been able to explain it that well, but that's the point. The average person is unlikely to appreciate the subtle nuances of these terms. And that's a reason for concern. Those who reject the loyalty, the legitimacy of Jewish Americans, well, you can expect them to be quoting from this executive order. And you can also expect others to be simply confused. I don't know if anyone here has ever been asked the question, wait, are you an American or are you a Jew? But sadly, get ready to be asked that. A person wiser than me once said the miracle of Torah is that it says exactly what we need it to each and every week. And I'll tell you, as a rabbi tasked with writing sermons, this is an incredibly pragmatic miracle. Our portion starts with Jacob about to reunite with his brother Esau. To briefly recap the story, the last they had spoken, Jacob had deceived their father Isaac, had taken the birthright that was supposed to go to Esau, and Esau wasn't too happy at the time. Specifically, he said that once their father Isaac died, he was going to kill his brother Jacob. So here they are, decades later, about to reunite. Jacob has no idea how his brother is going to react. All he knows is that he had threatened to kill him. His mother had said that, give him a few decades and he'll probably cool off, but really, who knows? And now here he is coming toward him with 400 men. What is Jacob feeling in this moment? Our impulse is probably to say fear. Imagining myself in that situation, that's probably where I would go. And that is where Jacob goes, but that's not the only reaction that he has. After a few moments of what appears to be panic, Jacob prays. He clears his head and he thinks. And he arrives at a different place, a place of uncertainty. Angry brother, 400 men coming at him. His first instinct was to connect those dots and arrive at the conclusion that he was about to be killed. But now, after taking a moment to think, to reflect, he realizes that that's not the only way to connect those dots. Are these men his brother's employees? Are they his bodyguards? Are they his army? Is this just how his brother travels? Or are these men with him, especially for this reunion? After taking a moment, Jacob realizes that all of those are possibilities, and he needs to consider all of them. And he does. And that's what the Jewish community did when the news first broke about the executive order. I'm just kidding. We totally panicked. Faced with a lack of information, we connected the few dots we knew and came to alarming conclusions. There were those who feared we were suddenly going to have the word Jew stamped on our driver's license or our passport, that we were going to be stripped of our American citizenship, that we were going to be deported. And then days later, the details emerged. Title VI protections protect groups on college campuses, but they did not explicitly name religious groups, and as a result, acts of anti-Semitism were not covered. The executive order stated that Jews would be treated as if they were a race or nation for the purposes of protection, in part because regardless of what we actually are, and if I've made anything clear, I hope that it's we have no idea what we actually are, none of that matters because those who dislike us see us as a race or a nation. This policy was first implemented by the Department of Education in 2010. The executive order does nothing to alter how the government treats or sees Jews. At least that's the consensus of the experts that I read this last week. Jacob never ends up needing to choose between fight or flight. He reunites with his brother. As the Torah recounts, when Esau saw him, he ran to him, he embraced him, he cried. That was only possible because Jacob resisted the urge in the face of confusion to come to the most obvious conclusion. He allowed himself room to think and to change. Despite not having any real effect on governmental policy, simply by by being drafted, the executive order does send a message. Whether you think it's a good or a bad one is truly a matter of opinion. As many of you have no doubt seen, Rabbi Greenstein and Rhodes College president Marjorie Haas wrote an op-ed in today's Commercial Appeal, arguing and explaining why they believe the message is damaging. It's absolutely worth reading. And if you do, you'll see the critique is based on the potential consequences of making such a public statement. It is a far different perspective than the panicked reactions earlier this week that warned of an existential threat to Jewish status as citizens. As the journalist Yair Rosenberg notes, social media incentives tend to reward our worst instincts. If two people with equal followings post two different tweets, one that says, "This order seems unusual and might be a problem," whereas the other person posts, "We're all about to be deported," you can imagine which tweet is going to get more attention. And it's worth imagining if Jacob would have reacted as well had he been surrounded by people predicting destruction. Rosenberg goes on to say that not only does alarmism hurt public discourse, but it scares real people. In times of fear, it's worth taking comfort in Nachmanides' approach. He says we ought to use Jacob as a model for our lives. When faced with the unknown, the scary, the confusing, we need to be prepared to pray, to make peace with those we fear, and to protect ourselves. All three at the same time, because we do not know which one will be needed. And most of all, we need to stay off Twitter. Shabbat Shalom.